Vessels and start lymphatic today. We're going to do fetal circulation. Fetal circulation is, by the way, one of my favorites. I like hepatic portal. I like fetal circulation. Okay, fetal circulation is really cool. So you have this figure from your textbook. You also have this one down here. Whichever one you want to work through while we're talking, you can use. Okay, so last time we started talking about the big picture of fetal circulation and why fetal and maternal blood, why fetal blood doesn't need separate systemic and pulmonary circulation, right? And so before we get any further, we have to acknowledge that we're going to be talking about a structure called the placenta, but most people have no idea what the placenta is. A lot of people who even think that they do have no idea what the placenta is. So I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. We are in an abstinence-only sex education state, which means that people don't know a damn thing. And I came from one too, right? I thought you had babies out of your butt until I was 12, honestly. So I didn't know there was anything else down there. I never really rooted around. For those of you who already understand this, please, I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. I'm trying to gather the entire fold. Okay, so let's talk about what the placenta is. Okay, the placenta is a weird looking alien structure, okay, that develops at the site of implantation in the uterus. So here's the deal. Okay, fertilization is not pregnancy. Fertilization doesn't change anything about the chemistry of the woman. Nothing in her even knows that it occurs. 50% of fertilization events just get flushed right out. Only 50% will actually implant. Implantation does not occur in the fallopian tubes if you're lucky. Shouldn't occur in the fallopian tubes. It should occur in the wall of the uterus. You guys with me? Okay. At the site of implantation, you are going to eventually develop this big fleshy structure. It's about that big, called the placenta. And the placenta is a disc-shaped structure that develops on the wall of the uterus, and it is the site of communication between maternal blood and fetal blood. Okay, here's what's going to happen with the placenta. At the site of implantation, the mom is going to start developing more blood flow to her uterus, right? Okay, and develop way more capillaries in the wall of her uterus than she had when she wasn't pregnant. Everybody cool with that? Okay, that's the maternal side. The fetal side, give it a little while until the fetus actually develops some tissues. At the site of implantation, eventually the fetus is going to develop a fetal bloodstream, right? And what we need these two bloodstreams to snuggle, but never have continuous flow between them. Why do you not want continuous flow between maternal blood and fetal blood?
It could be different.
Yes, of course. That critter inside you is half not you. Hi.
Can I just get something out of
Sure.
here? My last class.
Yeah,
Thanks.
go ahead. That critter inside you is half not you. Your immune system will treat it as a foreign invader if it recognizes it. Does that make sense? So what we need to have is not blood vessels like that. We need to have them snuggled up to one another, never continuous, but so snuggled up that you can have oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrient, and waste exchange because they're so close to one another. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so it's half fetal blood and half maternal blood, fetal blood. Does that make sense? Okay, and that structure is going to be called the placenta, and it's going to develop in the wall of the mom's uterus. Okay, so let's talk about what's going to be going on here. What's going to be going on is the fetal circulation is going to be different than the adult because instead of the fetal lungs providing oxygen, it's going to be the placenta. Instead of the fetal digestive tract providing nutrients, it's going to be the placenta, right? Instead of the fetal lungs getting rid of carbon dioxide, it's going to be the placenta, right? Instead of the fetal urinary and digestive tract getting rid of waste products, it's going to be the placenta, right? So everything's got to lead back to the placenta. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so what I want you to imagine is this is a baby. It's not the cutest baby you ever saw, right? Because they ain't got no skin on it, right? But here's the baby's belly button, right? Okay, you with me? Here's the rest of the baby. He's got no arms and no legs. Don't make fun. Okay, here's the rest of the baby. Here's the placenta. All of this is inside the uterus. How about the amniotic sacs? So the amniotic sacs are not directly related to our story, but let's acknowledge the fact that our fetus, when we were a fetus, we were an aquatic mammal. Were we not? okay? And what we had is, in addition to this, we had a big sac, a big juicy sac all the way around us that was also inside the uterus. Does that make sense? Okay. It's not directly related to this story, but it's part of the picture that we're seeing here. Okay. So the amniotic sac and the placenta are not the same structure. Okay. People interchange them. Okay. So what is going to happen is we are going to get blood to and from the placenta. So stick with me for a second. Okay, here's the placenta on the wall of the mom's uterus. This is where, let's just follow oxygen, because it's the one that changes color, right? And if we can figure out what oxygen is doing, we can figure out what nutrients are doing, right? We can figure out what carbon dioxide is doing, we can figure out what wastes are doing, right? So what's going to happen is the mom is going to pump via her systemic circulation blood to her uterus, right? And it's going to get a disproportionate amount of the blood when she's pregnant, right? She actually has to increase her blood volume when she's pregnant, and her blood pressure. So she's going to deliver oxygenated blood to the wall of her uterus. And then what's going to happen is it's going to go through the wall of her uterus, and then the placenta is going to pick up that oxygenated blood. Everybody with me? Okay. And then that oxygenated blood is going to go through this big red vessel, yes, toward the baby's belly button, yes? And that big red vessel is going to be an umbilical what? Vein or artery? Where's it going relative to the fetus? Towards the heart. It's going to be an umbilical vein. It's an umbilical vein. Does that make sense? It's the only really, really highly oxygenated vessel in this entire story. Everybody with me? So this is going to go into the fetus's belly button, yes? And it's going to go and it's going to dump into the inferior vena cava just behind the liver. Everybody with me? Now that's weird because it means you're mixing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. We will see that the fetus has a lot of mixed oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. That, of course, compromises the efficiency of the system. Does anybody know how a fetus will compensate for that? Know anything about fetal heart rate? It's really fast. So they do a lot of blood flow really quickly. Okay? All right, so here's what we're going to do. We just dumped this from the umbilical what? Vein into the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is going to go where it always does. What chamber does it go to? Right atrium. Good? Okay, you're going to dump it into the right atrium. But the right atrium and the left atrium do not need to be entirely separate because, think about this, do the fetal lungs need different blood than the rest of the fetal organs? No, they need blood that's pretty high oxygen, right? Because they're not doing their own oxygen exchange from the environment, right? So they need the same kind of blood as the rest of the body. Good? So now I don't need a separate left and right heart. I need them to function as a single pump. One of the ways that I can do that is there is a hole during fetal circulation between the left and the right atrium. Does anybody know what that hole's called when it's open? That's when it's closed. It's called foramen ovale when it's opened, right? Okay. So the foramen ovale will allow some of the blood to stay in the right side of the heart and some of it to go over the left side of the heart, right? Regardless of how you got into the atria, what's going to happen is the blood's going to do what it does. Move from the atria to the ventricles, yes? Then the ventricles will contract and it will push it into the great arteries, meaning the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Good? Okay. But we don't need a disproportionate amount of that blood to go to the lungs because they're not doing a separate function, right? So what happens is there is another opportunity for exchange right there. And that is between that little vessel right there, which isn't open in you anymore, between the aortic arch and the pulmonary trunk, there is an open vessel in a fetus, right? And it's called the ductus arteriosus. And what it does is it allows blood to shunt between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, right? So we don't need a disproportionate amount of blood. Do you know what that's called when it closes? You can still see it in an adult. It connects the aortic arch and the pulmonary trunk. You can see it on all the models that we have. Do you know? Ligamentum arteriosum, yes. That's a remnant of a fetal structure. Is that good? Ligamentum arteriosum. Okay, so now we are going to deliver blood to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk, right? And then we're going to deliver blood to all of the typical systemic circulation via the aorta, right? Does that make sense? Okay. And then, of course, what else are we going to do? Well, in addition to doing that, we're going to have to deliver blood back to the placenta. So you guys tell me, without looking, what vessel do you think will deliver blood No, I won't ask you that. Okay, I'll ask you in a minute. Okay, so we are going to deliver blood into the aorta. It's going to go to all of systemic circulation. In addition to all of systemic circulation, we are going to have a branch off of course, we go common iliacs, right? And then internal iliacs. And there is a branch off of each of your internal iliacs, right? Which is called the umbilical what? What is it going to be? Umbilical arteries, left and right umbilical arteries. They're going to go back out the baby's belly button, wrap around the umbilical cord, and deliver blood back to the placenta. What kind of blood are they delivering? Relatively low oxygen blood, relatively high waste blood, right? High carbon dioxide. And then what's going to happen is as soon as you get to those placental capillaries, carbon dioxide is going to move out of fetal circulation into maternal circulation. Waste products are going to move out of fetal circulation into maternal circulation. Simultaneously, oxygen is going to move out of maternal circulation into fetal nutrients, out of maternal into fetal. Does that make sense? So you do the exchange all over again. Everybody good? Okay, we're going to go through it one more time. Here's a question for you, though. Can you figure out which artery probably gives rise to blood supply to the uterus in the mom? What do you think? Think about it. Which artery in the mom will give blood supply to the uterus? Go ahead. No, it's not the gonadal. It's a good guess, though. What gives blood supply to most of your pelvic cavity? Primarily the internal iliac artery. Yeah? Okay, a little bit of the external, too. Good? Okay, so we're going to do it together this time. You ready? Okay, and then we'll talk about the whole delivery thing. Okay, so I want you guys to start this time. You ready? Okay. We're going to start it wherever the hell we want, but let's start with the vessel in this story that has the highest oxygen content. What's that? Umbilical vein. Yes? And the umbilical vein is going from the placenta to the fetus. Yes? And it's going to dump into what vessel? Inferior vena cava, right? And then the inferior vena cava is going to go back to the right atrium like it always does. The first place that we get exchange between typical, right? Typical what would be systemic and pulmonary blood is the hull between the left and the right atrium. What's that called? Foramen ovale, right? And then the blood will go from the atria to the ventricles. It comes from the ventricles into the great arteries, right? And the vessel that allows for exchange between the great arteries, meaning the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, is what? Ductus arteriosus, right? Okay. And then, of course, we are going to give blood to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk, like we normally would. And we're going to give blood to all of typical systemic circulation via the aorta, right? Okay. And then as we go through the aorta and give blood supply to all of these places, let's just acknowledge that the systemic venous blood would get back to the fetal heart the same way that you would expect, right? So for instance, how would the blood from the fetal legs get back to the heart, right? Ultimately the inferior vena cava and all the way back. So once it gets into fetal systemic circulation, it works like you'd expect it to, except the placenta, right? The placenta is extra, okay? So in addition to typical fetal arterial circulation, we have one extra vessel, which is a branch off of, here's the common, here's the internal iliacs, right? And this is what vessels right here? Umbilical arteries. They are going to where? To the placenta. Exactly. Does that make sense? Got it? Okay, go ahead.
When does the mother and the placenta stop supplying blood to the fetus?
Let's at birth. We'll talk about that in give me just a second. Okay, so the idea is the fetal heart is pumping blood to all organs and also to the placenta, right? Does that make sense? So all organs and also to the placenta. So it has this extra organ, right, that you don't have anymore. And so let's talk about what will happen at birth, and how all of this stuff sort of goes away and how it matures into your adulthood. Okay, so one of the things that happens right when a baby is born is we need to get As soon as the lungs start functioning, we need to get a good separation between systemic and pulmonary blood, right? Because we need the pulmonary blood to pick up oxygen, systemic blood to use oxygen. So we need a good separation. So in a healthy baby, what happens about the time the baby takes its first breath is the foramen ovale will slam shut. And it slams shut due to pressure changes. It's not healed yet, but it's sort of held closed as it's healing, right? One of the good indications that that has occurred is that the baby will pink up, because you'll get a good separation between systemic and pulmonary blood, and so you are going to be delivering really highly oxygenated blood to your systemic capillaries, and the baby will pink up, right? The other thing is that if the lungs are functioning properly, the baby should be able to make some noise. Does that make sense? So when I was little, because I'm old, they used to still smack us, right? You were born, you just had the worst day of your damn life, right? It's noisy and bright, and like you used to be floating in a pool, and now you get out there and somebody slaps you on your little baby butt, right? To hear you cry. Well, the baby crying or the baby making some kind of noise is a good indication that their lungs are functioning, right? Didn't happen with my son for reasons I'll tell you in just a second. Okay, so that should happen immediately upon the first breath, and they're a little worried if it doesn't, okay? Now, the next thing that should happen is that you need to deliver that afterwards. So I want to talk about a typical vaginal delivery, right? So you have a typical vaginal delivery and the baby comes out, but the umbilical cord is still going up, right? Still going into the vagina. So what they're going to do, of course, is they are going to cut and clip the umbilical cord, right? Because now the baby has its own source of oxygen, right? It hasn't eaten anything, but that'll come later, right? You still got it. Hopefully it's nice and chubby anyway, right? So you clip the umbilical cord, and now the placenta is no longer getting fetal blood. Yes? But in addition, during the childbirth process, generally what happens is the placenta rips off the wall of the mother's uterus. When you tear those two capillaries apart, it's bloody, right? That's part of the reason that it's bloody, because you had two capillary beds that were entwined. You yank it off the wall, right? So now I've got a placenta that is no longer getting maternal blood and no longer getting fetal blood. You have a chunk of dead or dying tissue that is in your uterus. And if you do not get every damn piece of it out, it will become necrotic and it will kill you dead as a hammer. So the next thing that has to happen is the placenta has to be delivered. It's called the afterbirth or the placenta. How many of you guys have seen one? They're so damn weird looking. There is one on Redwood campus, by the way. One of my students donated one last semester. Wasn't that sweet? And I preserved it and I stuck her name on it. Right? I totally did. I was like, I totally want a placenta. And she's like, I totally have one. You want it? So she gave it to me. I know, I'm a weirdo. I'm going to ask you for all your parts. You're like, are you using that anymore? Can I have that? I've got gallstones and placentas and all kinds of weird shit. Okay. So anyway, you have to deliver it, and then of course they have to look it over to make sure that it doesn't look like there's any single part missing. This is important whether you're a human mom or a doggy mom or a kitty mom, right? If your cat has kittens, you got to look at the placenta. If your dog has puppies, you got to look at the placenta, because if it stays in there, it will kill them. Okay? So the placenta is delivered as afterbirth, and then of course they try to massage the uterus to stop the bleeding. It's pretty bloody, the whole thing. So FYI, childbirth is dangerous. I want to acknowledge the fact that this is the case. We are not first in maternal survival rates in the world. We are not second. We are not fifth. We are seventh in maternal survival rates. We do not have an incredibly good record. We are well below Canada. Use that for your argument for not socializing medicine. I don't know. So it's dangerous. It is bloody. There is potential for hemorrhaging for both the fetus and the mom. People do survive. There's 7 billion people, right? But not all people survive. Okay, and then the next thing that needs to happen, it usually takes 1 to 2 days before this happens, is the ligamentum arteriosum has to close for you to get a complete separation between maternal and fetal blood. When that happens, usually the oxygen content in the fetus will go up again, right? So it goes up, the baby is pinking up, but it's not quite as high as you want it to be. Usually, of course, the baby stays in the hospital between 24 and 48 hours, right? And then as soon as their oxygen saturation goes up and the mom is still healthy, then usually that's when the baby goes home. As their oxygen saturation goes up and they're like, okay, the ligamentum arteriosum probably closed. Does that make sense to you? Sometimes it takes a little longer for that to occur. Go ahead.
So I attended a conference and a lot of them.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering, what is the theory on the Eastern medicine side of leaving the umbilical cord connected for 1 or 2 hours?
I have no idea. I don't know whether there is science behind it, or I just don't know the science behind it. I would be perfectly willing to be educated. But there's a lot that I don't know. Go ahead.
So my mom lost a lot of like babies due to different blood.
She's RH negative. I'll teach you about that in just a second. Give me just a second, okay? It has to do with the next story that we're going to tell as well. Okay, so the ligamentum arteriosum will usually close in 1 to 2 days. So let's talk about a couple of things. Let's talk about cesarean sections. Let's talk about, and then we'll talk about this in just a minute. And it has to do with the next story that we're going to tell. Okay, so cesarean sections. I had to have a cesarean section. I had a planned cesarean section because I have a heart problem and I can't go through labor, right? So one of the things that happens with cesarean sections, and one of the reasons that they say that if you can give vaginal delivery, it's best for the baby, is because it is best for the baby to give vaginal delivery. Because one of the things that happens is when the baby is actually going through the vagina, and generally what happens is the amniotic sac breaks open, right? And the water, right? It's not water, it's amniotic fluid, right? Your water breaks, yes? And then the baby comes out after that. So you have this time in which you go from being an aquatic mammal, right? And as you go through the vaginal canal, what happens is you compress the lungs and you squeeze the fluid out of the lungs as you go through the vagina, right? Does that make sense? So then when you're born, your lungs are dry enough to actually be able to do gas exchange. Well, with my son, first off, he came 2.5 weeks early, and the lungs are the last thing to mature. And then second, I had to do a C-section. When he came out, his lungs were still relatively full of fluid, right? They sliced through the amniotic sac and I watched the whole thing, so sliced through everything. It's so weird, alien. So they pull him out and he's totally purple, which most babies are, but then they immediately breathe, right? But he didn't, and you couldn't hear anything. And all that fluid in his lungs made it really difficult for him to breathe, and he actually popped a mediastinothorax and one of his lungs collapsed. So he couldn't actually breathe. And that is in part one of the risks associated with cesarean sections, right? And it's a relatively understandable natural risk. And do I feel terrible? Of course I do. But the other option was we both died in childbirth, right? So I felt terrible about it. And so now he's obviously going to get a car when he's 16. I mean, let's be serious. He's also incredibly charming, so I would get it for him anyway. Go ahead.
I was also a cesarean section, and I was born with like pneumonia.
Yeah. It's just one of the complications. Your lungs don't dry out as much. That's one of the issues with cesarean sections. So I know a lot of women have started choosing cesarean sections because it's actually easier to recover from a cesarean section if it's planned than it is from a vaginal delivery. But there are risks associated with it. And they're pretty big risks associated with it, actually. Okay, so that's the whole C-section related to this. Don't go shaming women about how they give birth. I've had women say, if you did not give birth vaginally, you are not a real mother. Well, I say F you, right? Right? I've got like one of my hippie school parents has a thing, birth the way that it was intended. I intended to live through my birth is what I intended to. Okay, so we're going to get to your question. Okay, so let's get to your question, and then we'll talk about the next one. This is directly related to the next stuff that we are going to be doing. Okay, so since the baby is not the mom, right, and is half different genetics than you, if the mom's immune system has a way of recognizing that there's a foreign invader in there, what can happen is your immune system will launch an attack against it, right, and will cause a miscarriage. Yes? This is very, very common with when the mother is Rh negative and the baby is Rh positive. So I won't tell you a ton about these, but let's just say that the Rh factor is an antigen, a little protein sugar flag that's on the surface of your cells, right? And if I'm Rh negative, I don't have it, so anybody that does have it will look like an invader, right? And if my partner, yes, is Rh positive, it is very likely, about 50% likelihood, that we will have an Rh positive baby, especially since positive is dominant to negative, right? You guys with me so far? Okay, so let's say I am an Rh negative mom and I have an Rh positive partner, yes? And I get pregnant and the baby is Rh positive. If my immune system recognizes it, then you can have a miscarriage because of it. It will just basically say there is something nasty in here, get it the hell out, okay? So historically speaking, women who are Rh negative have had way, way more miscarriages than other people, and they didn't know for a really long time what the hell was going on. And then they figured out, oh, it's basically because your partner is Rh positive and you're recognizing it every time. And the Rh factor develops relatively early in the whole development process, and your immune system responds to it. It's far more likely for you to miscarry an Rh positive baby on the second baby, because what happens is during delivery, remember when you pull those two capillary beds apart, there really wasn't much knowledge that there was another organism in there until you pull the capillary beds apart, and then my blood can see the baby's blood, yes? And then what happens is my immune system is like, hell, what's going on in here, right? So then if you get pregnant with another Rh positive baby, then I've already made a whole bunch of antibodies and it can cause a miscarriage. Luckily now, if you're Rh negative, we have a way to protect both you and your baby, right? You just have to know. This is one of the reasons that maternal care during pregnancy is really, really important, because there is now a shot that we can give you that actually masks the Rh positive from the mom's immune system, right? And you can have healthy pregnancies, right? It basically just covers up the antigens so that you can't see it. Does that make sense? Cool? Everybody good? Okay.
Is that like genetic?
It is genetic, yes. And it's not a problem. Like the antigen, either antigen is totally fine to have. It's just that when the mom's immune system notices it, she launches an immune system response against it, and it develops really early so she can see it, right? Doesn't usually see it with the first pregnancy, though. Usually sees it with the second Rh pregnancy. Go ahead.
This is about the placenta. Do
Okay.
twins share a placenta?
It depends on whether they're monozygotic or dizygotic. If you are, do we have any twins in here? No? Which one are you? What are you, fraternal or? Okay, two implantations, right? 2 placentas, 2 amniotic sacs. You guys were like just roommates, right? Okay, so you were just roommates with your brother or sister? Sister? Yeah, they were definitely just roommates. Don't even really like her that much anymore, right? So just roommates, right? Monozygotic twins, 1 fertilization, 1 implantation, early mitosis, yes, to develop two different beings with exactly the same genetics, exactly the same amniotic fluid, everything. Good? Okay. All right. So that Rh discussion was totally relevant to this discussion that we're about to give, which is the lymphatic system. By the way, I'm going to say it again. I really like fetal circulation. Okay. So with the lymphatic system, we're not going to get too far into it today. I just want to give you guys a big picture understanding. And usually people haven't had a damn thing about the lymphatic system their entire academic career. So I'm going to give you sort of a quick and dirty overview of what the lymphatic system is like. Today, I primarily want you to get an appreciation for it, and then we'll deal with the specific structures on Wednesday. Okay, so here's the deal with the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system, you probably haven't even seen it before. It's usually represented as green. They're not green. What it is a set of vessels that are even thinner walled than veins. And you notice how much easier arteries were defined than veins, right? Okay, because veins collapse. So these are tinier than veins and they're thinner walled. So unless you are specifically looking for them, you are not going to find them. It's a set of vessels that typically runs parallel to your venous system. And ultimately what it's going to do is the blood is going to go up your lymphatic system and dump back into your subclavian veins. Not blood, I said blood, fluid. The fluid is going to go through your lymphatic system and dump back into your subclavian veins. So where did it come from? Well, remember me telling you, when we went through capillary beds, we always leak fluid out of capillary beds? Remember saying that? Because, of course, the capillary is high pressure and the interstitial fluid is low pressure. And I told you that we actually regain most of that fluid by osmosis, right? So we leak it out and we pick it back up by osmosis. But you actually only do that with about 90% of the fluid. You lose 10% of the fluid every single time you go through a capillary bed. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole hell of a lot, but you got a lot of capillary beds, and if you lost 10% every time, you would look like the Michelin Man within a matter of an hour, right? You'd be so enormous with all that tissue fluid. Does that make sense? Okay, so how do you gather up the rest of the fluid? The way you gather out the rest of the fluid is gather a bunch of it back up by osmosis. The rest of it I pull back up into these different vessels, the lymphatic vessels, and slowly percolate it all the way up and dump it back into my lymphatic system. And as I percolate it up, by the way, guys, I am assessing it to see if there are any pathogens, any antigens, right? Anything that could be an infectious agent. If they exist in there, then I am going to activate my immune system in the process. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's basically a separate set of tubing that's kind of parallel to your veins, and it dumps back in here. Is that okay? So that's called the lymphatic system, and we'll talk about the nodes and the functionality of the nodes before. Okay. So let's talk about what it does. Basically, your lymphatic system drains excess tissue fluid from spaces, and it also drains the other stuff that you can't pick up by osmosis. Osmosis only moves water, right? But you push more than water out by filtration, like you push big proteins and ions. How do you gather those back up? Those have to go back into your lymphatic system, right? So anything that I leaked out that wasn't water has to be pulled back up a different way than osmosis. Go ahead.
Are these vessels like visible to the eye?
Only if you know really what you're looking for. Yes, they are. I mean, I have to dig for them, and I have to make sure that it's not just like a ligament or something. I have to like roll it in my fingers to make sure that it's actually an open vessel. So it takes me a little while to find them, so you won't see them unless you specifically, and they're not really pigmented either. They're so thin-walled that they're kind of clear, and they kind of look like just connective tissue. So you kind of have to prove to yourself what they are, but you can see them. Okay, so let's talk about what would happen if those got blocked. Okay. So if they get blocked, then what happens is you can't get that 10% of fluid back in. So this is called lymphedema when it occurs. It's when you build up excess fluid in an area. Lymphedema is a common complication of a mastectomy. So if a woman had breast cancer, or even a man for that matter, somebody had breast cancer, one of the things that they do is, in addition to removing the tumor and maybe even the entire breast tissue, they'll also remove the lymphatic tissue in the area, because the lymphatic system is a common route for metastasis. It's a common route for metastasis. So they'll remove the lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes in the entire area. Well, that will cause problem with draining excess fluid from the arm, right? So your arm can actually plump up, right? And they use compression garments, right, to try to keep the fluid from building up in there. Does that make sense? So that's called lymphedema. And then let's talk about another. There's also an infectious organism. It's a parasite that is carried from person to person by biting flies and mosquitoes, and it causes elephantiasis. What it is a little parasitic worm. It's an animal, and you're an animal, which will make it hard to treat. Okay, it's a little parasitic worm, and if I had it, right, and it bit me, even if I didn't show any symptoms of it, it could carry the eggs from me to her. So it's kind of communicable, right? And the eggs are carryable from one place to the next. And what it will do is, during its larval stages, it likes to sit in your lymphatic vessels and grow in the larval stages. And so imagine that you had those organisms growing in these vessels. Then they would eventually block the vessel, and what would happen to the size of your lower leg? It would get enormous, right? Or it could block vessels here, and your entire leg could get enormous. Or it could block vessels in your scrotum, and then your scrotum will get enormous, or in your breast, right? All of those locations, especially at joint locations, it's really easy to block because they're kind of compressed anyway, and there's like not as many roots to go through there. So that is called elephantiasis. I'll show you what elephantiasis looks like. So here's elephantiasis of the lower leg. That's elephantiasis. Go ahead.
What is that parasite feeding off of for the lymphatic system?
You know, I don't actually know why they end up in the lymphatic system. That's a good question. I'll try to think about it, Sarah. I don't know why they end up there. Might just be because they get picked up by, the eggs get picked up by the lymphatic system, and then they just start growing. So if it gets pushed out of the bloodstream, I don't know. That's a really good question. I'll try to remember to investigate that. So here's another one. Okay. And then here's this disturbing one. This one was in an entire village because it ends up being kind of communicable, right? You don't catch it from the person, but the organisms in the area. All of these dudes have elephantiasis of the scrotum. Yeah, that's not a good day for any of them, right? So it is treatable. And the way in which it's treatable is you have to basically poison it out of your system. And you're an animal, and the thing in you is an animal. And so the treatment is pretty nasty on your system, right? So it doesn't, for instance, have a cell wall because it's an animal cell. So you can't use like an antibiotic. You can't use an antifungal agent. Those things might bother you a little bit, but the cells are different than your cells. So you can always use some kind of difference. When you have a multicellular animal parasite, then the treatment is a little hard on you, right? It's kind of like a chemotherapy, right? You end up taking out half of your good cells when you're trying to take out the bad ones. Anyway, so that's elephantiasis. Okay, so we will talk about HIV and AIDS in just a second. We talked about leaked proteins getting transported back into the bloodstream via the lymphatic system. And then one last thing before we start talking about the immune function. The last thing is that so let's talk about Thanksgiving. Okay. When you eat at Thanksgiving, we know that, for instance, the vast majority of stuff that you absorb from the small intestine, so you ate a piece of pie, right? And you're going to absorb the nutrients and potentially funky stuff from whatever the pie was, right? And it's going to go into your superior vena cava, small intestine, superior vena cava. It'll get shunted through your hepatic portal system before it gets dumped in, right? So if there was anything funky, like if grandma left it out on the counter for like 2 weeks before she cooked with it, right? Because grandma's old, and we're still gonna eat her pie because we love her. What would happen is whatever toxins or pathogens that you took in would end up getting shunted through hepatic portal circulation, and hopefully you wouldn't die, right? That is not the case with lipid-soluble toxins or pathogens, because lipid-soluble toxins or pathogens do not get absorbed into the bloodstream, they get absorbed into the lymphatic system, which means that they don't go through hepatic portal circulation. They get dumped immediately into your subclavian veins, right? And then back into circulation, and they get to go a whole round before they go through the liver, right? So that's another reason that lipid-soluble toxins, pathogens are really difficult to clear from the system. In addition, your kidneys don't help you clear them, right? So something kind of interesting about that is that right after a really fatty meal, like Thursday, because if you're not eating fat, I don't know why the hell you're going, right? On Thursday, right after that, if you assess your lymphatic fluid, right after you eat Thanksgiving dinner, it's got so much fat in it that it's almost opaque. And then if you give yourself a few minutes after that, it will eventually get dumped into your bloodstream. It's about 20 minutes before it all gets dumped into your bloodstream. And then your blood plasma is almost opaque. Ew! I'm going to eat 3 helpings of mashed potatoes anyway. I don't even care. I do care, but I won't care then. Okay, so now, with our last 10 minutes, I want to talk about the immune system action of your lymphatic system. This is the other important function, and we'll talk about HIV and AIDS when we're talking about this. Okay, so FYI, when I am telling you guys about this, I want you to get the big picture. I'm probably not going to test you over the images that I use because it's hard to grasp this stuff. I want it to be maybe the first time, maybe the second time, maybe the time that you actually understand this. But please just focus on the big picture and don't think I'm going to try to nitpick you about all of this. I would just stuff that I think you should know as a human. Okay, so part of the lymphatic system function is the immune system. And I want to differentiate between immune and defense. Defense is when I get exposed to a pathogen and then I respond to that pathogen, that's defense. Defense is when I'm walking by a corner and somebody around the corner just hits me in the face and I hit them back. That's defense, right? Immunity is learning from the experience so that it doesn't happen the same way next time. So we are going to talk about developing immunity. Immunity means that I remember that organism and I'm more prepared for it the next time. It means that the next time I walk by that corner, I am looking for that bastard and I'm carrying a baseball bat, right? That's immunity. Does that make sense? Okay. So we are going to talk about immunity. And immunity is specific and it gets smarter. So you guys learned some of the white blood cell types. I want to talk about a specific type of white blood cell called a lymphocyte, which are very active in the lymphatic system. Not exclusively, but they are very active in the lymphatic system. You with me? Okay. So these are types of white blood cells, and specifically I'm going to teach you guys about B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. B lymphocytes are called B because they mature in the bone marrow, And T lymphocytes are called T because they mature in the thymus. That's the names for both of them. That's why they're called that. Okay? So what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about exposures and immunity development, and then we'll talk about vaccinations. Okay? Ready? All right, so I'm going to show you this picture. It's going to look horrible at first. It will not look as horrible in a minute. Okay? Ready? Okay. So I want to imagine that I'm going to get exposed to the measles. Okay? And the measles are not me. So measles will have an antigen on their surface, which is a protein-sugar combination. It's basically a flag. And whenever I see this flag, I will know that it's not my flag. Yes? Okay? That's what an antigen is. Okay? So here's what's going to happen, and then I'll go back and add a little bit more detail. So what's going to happen is when this B lymphocyte meets this antigen, what will happen is the B lymphocyte is going to try to take care of the immediate threat, but then it's also going to remember it for next time. Taking care of the immediate threat is secreting some stuff that can whoop up on anything with those antigens. These are called antibodies. Okay? Antibodies are proteins. They get dumped into your bloodstream. They will go and take care of anything that has that antigen on it. Does that make sense? Okay? But importantly, and this is the important part, they also remember specifically that antigen and make more that remember it with every exposure. So this is one cell getting activated one time. It is going to remember that specific antigen. Sorry. It's going to remember that specific antigen. So from one memory B lymphocyte, I get 2. From 2, I get 4. From 4, I get 8. From 8, I get 16. 32, right? And so I didn't just activate one. So can you see that the first time I get exposed, I may get sick. Hopefully I'll live through it. But the second time I get exposed, how quickly do I respond to that exposure? Well, I had all of those. I didn't have one memory B lymphocyte for that antigen. I had 10,000 maybe, right? Does that make sense? You got it? So these remember this specific antigen, are waiting around for it the next time, right? And they are all capable of making baseball bats. Every single one of them, very, very quickly. Okay? Is that good? This is the basis of vaccination. Okay? With vaccination, what I want to do is, some pathogens are so damn potentially deadly that I actually do not want to meet the pathogen without a baseball bat. Right? So the measles is a good one to talk about. So let's talk about measles. Measles sound like a small thing, but measles are potentially deadly, right? And most of us don't get measles, although there's been outbreaks all over the United States because of the whole anti-vaccination thing. So I want to talk about that. So what's going to happen is with measles or with vaccines, what they give you is either they give you a killed organism that has the antigen, right? It's killed so it can't go through cell division, right? Or they give you just the antigen without the organism on it, right? And what they do is they launch this immune system maturation so that you will be prepared if you get exposed to the real antigen. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is how this actually works. Okay, so now I want to talk about the whole anti-vaccine thing and the arguments that people make and the reason that I vaccinate my kids, even though I do know that there are some risks associated with the vaccinations. So here is the reason that this is good. First of all, if the exposure to measles can kill him, of course I want him to live through the exposure, right? Even though measles is relatively rare and he probably won't encounter it, I'm still going to vaccinate him against anything that the exposure could potentially kill him or cause brain damage. Measles causes brain damage as well. Here's the other reason. What if I just decide not to vaccinate my kid because of my First Amendment rights to whatever the hell, right? Probably not First Amendment. Yeah, it is First Amendment. Okay, so here's the deal. I want you guys to imagine that we are a population now, right? And I get exposed to measles, right? And so I'm going to make you immunocompromised again because she got a kidney transplant, so she can't get vaccinated. Everybody okay with that? I mean, she's not okay with it. But she's on immunosuppressants for the rest of her life because she got a kidney transplant and she can't get vaccinated. Everybody okay? You understand? And you are 5 months old and you can't get vaccinated. 5 weeks old. You can't get vaccinated either. Okay? So here I want to talk about the whole herd immunity thing. Okay? I want to talk about the epidemiology of pathogens and infectious agents. Okay? And I got exposed to measles. And for whatever the hell reason, maybe I was vaccinated, maybe I wasn't, because it's just decreasing your statistical likelihood of getting it. It's not making it impossible, right? I have the measles, and I actually exposed you to the measles, okay? And then we can start this epidemiology. So what I want to know is how protected are those two if 10% of this population is immunized? How protected are they? No, because remember, this is basically just like playing like links in a chain, right? If she's not immunized, then she's more likely to pass it on to 10, more likely to pass it on to 10, right? And if everyone here is unvaccinated except her, then it just goes around to get to the other person, right? And now I want you to imagine that 50% of you guys are vaccinated. Are they more protected? They're more protected, right? Now 80% of you guys are vaccinated. Now everybody but the two of them are vaccinated. Are they protected, potentially? Yeah, their stats are looking pretty damn good. Does that make sense to you guys? So this is the whole idea about herd immunity. They say, why the hell do you care if my kids are vaccinated if your kids aren't? Because I don't just care about your kids or my kids. I care about the kids that can't be vaccinated, right? I care about this mom right here that has to come into the public school with her 5-week-old baby to pick up her 7-year-old child. Because she has to, right? You can't leave them in the car. They'll totally arrest you, right? Does that make sense? So this is the whole vaccination thing. And so measles has made a huge comeback in the United States because of anti-vaccination. In California, they are having to make it so that if your children are not vaccinated, they cannot come to public school, right? Which I am totally cool with. I mean, unless you have a reason not to vaccinate them, right? Okay. Oh my goodness. And pertussis can kill the little ones. Yeah. This is an example of like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, the whole anti-vaccination campaign. I want to tell you guys one more thing before we leave. Okay, so relationship between HIV and AIDS with our last few minutes. Okay, so what I didn't show you before is the relationship of the T cells to this. Okay, so do you see that this B lymphocyte is being presented the antigen by this T cell, right? This T lymphocyte. Because the T cells are actually the generals of the immune system. And so I want you to imagine that you are a B cell, but you are a soldier. And you could have as many measles antigens go by and you wouldn't do a damn thing unless you actually got the command. And I am a T cell. And I am the general, and I am the only one you will take the command from. So here's what happens. The T cell has to meet the antigen first. It has to whoop up on it, and then it put its head on a stake and present it to the B cell in order to start this whole thing, right? If it does not do that, then the B cell never responds. In addition, you also don't do macrophage activities. You never develop your immune system. And so now the tragedy of HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS takes out the generals of your immune system. It takes out the T cells. It specifically infects T cells, goes through cell division, lyses the T cell to release more HIV particles into the population to infect more T cells. And if you take out the general, does your immune system ever get any smarter? No. And you get every kind of opportunistic infection. In addition, those cytotoxic T cells in the middle, those protect you against your own cancers, right? So one of the things that distinguishes between HIV and AIDS is T cell count, right? So what happens as you go from HIV to full-blown AIDS? What happens to your T cell count? It goes down. And as your T cell count goes down, you get all kinds of weird opportunistic infections. You get freaking bird flu, right? You get weird crap that other people don't get because you are losing your protective factor because you lost your generals. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. What? Somebody had a question. Who had a question? Go ahead. Okay.